The day Brenda Patterson knocked on my door to tell me I couldn't have bonfires on my own lakefront property was the day I stopped caring about playing nice with the homeowners association. I had just moved into my dream house on Lake Minnetonka in Minnesota 3 months earlier. After years of working 70-hour weeks as a software engineer in Silicon Valley, I cashed out, sold my cramped condo, and bought a beautiful 2-acre property with private lake access. The whole point was to finally relax, to sit by fires on cool summer nights, to live the life I'd been dreaming about since I was a kid going to summer camp. My name is Aaron Rodriguez, and I'd worked too damn hard to let some power-hungry HOA president ruin this for me. Brenda stood on my porch that Tuesday afternoon in early June, clipboard in hand, wearing a pristine white visor and a polo shirt with the neighborhood logo embroidered on it. She was maybe 55, with that particular haircut that screamed, "I want to speak to the manager," and an expression that suggested she'd been sucking on lemons all morning. "Mr. Rodriguez, I'm here to inform you that your bonfire last Saturday night was in violation of our community regulations," she said, not even bothering with a greeting. I leaned against my doorframe, genuinely confused. "What are you talking about? I had a small fire in a proper fire pit on my own property." Section 12, Paragraph 4 of the HOA covenant clearly states that open flames are prohibited within the community boundaries between the hours of 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. "It was 8:30, I said. I was roasting marshmallows and watching the sunset. Brenda's lips pursed tighter. "Well, it was reported to me that the fire was excessively large and created a smoke nuisance for neighboring properties." I actually laughed. My nearest neighbor is 300 feet away, and the fire was maybe 2 feet across. I've seen birthday candles bigger than what I had going. "Regardless, I'm issuing you a formal warning. Any future violations will result in fines of $500 per incident." She thrust a piece of paper at me, which I took reflexively. "This is ridiculous. I specifically checked the covenants before I bought this place. There was nothing about fires on private lakefront property." "The rules were updated at our annual meeting in March. All homeowners were notified by mail." "I didn't move in until April," I said, feeling my jaw tighten. "And I never got any notification about rule changes." "That's not my problem, Mr. Rodriguez. Ignorance of the rules doesn't exempt you from following them." She turned to leave, then paused. "Oh, and your dock needs to be painted. It's looking shabby. That's another violation we'll be monitoring." I watched her walk back to her white Lexus SUV, fury building in my chest. My dock was fine. It was treated wood that was meant to weather naturally. This wasn't about community standards. This was about control. That evening, I dug through all my closing documents and found the original HOA covenants. I read through every single page, including all the fine print. There were rules about fence heights, rules about lawn maintenance, rules about exterior paint colors. But nowhere, absolutely nowhere, did it say anything about prohibiting fires on private property. There was a general clause about not creating nuisances, but that was vague and clearly meant for things like noise complaints or offensive odors. The next morning, I called the real estate attorney who'd handled my purchase. His name was Marcus Chen, and he'd been recommended by a friend who'd moved to Minneapolis a few years back. "Aaron, good to hear from you. How's the new place?" Marcus asked when he picked up. "It's great, except for the HOA, trying to tell me I can't have fires on my own lakefront." I explained the situation, including Brenda's visit and her claim about updated rules. Marcus was quiet for a moment. "Did you receive the updated covenants in writing?" She said they were mailed out in March, but I didn't move in until April. I never got anything. "That's a problem for them, not you. Minnesota law requires HOAs to provide written notice of covenant changes to all property owners of record. If they mailed it to the previous owner and not to you after the sale closed, that's their failure. But let me ask you something. Did you get a copy of the HOA meeting minutes where these changes were supposedly approved?" "No, I didn't even know there was a meeting." "Right. Here's what we're going to do. I'm going to send a formal letter to the HOA requesting copies of all meeting minutes, the voting records for any covenant changes, and proof that proper notice was given to all homeowners. We'll also ask for clarification on their authority to regulate activities on private lakefront property that don't impact common areas." "Will that actually stop them?" I asked. "It'll make them think twice. A lot of these HOA boards operate on the assumption that homeowners won't fight back. When you show up with an attorney, things change. I felt a little better after hanging up, but that relief lasted exactly 2 days, until I came home from a grocery run to find a bright orange notice taped to my front door. Another violation. Apparently my trash cans were visible from the street, which violated the aesthetic standards of the neighborhood. My trash cans were in the same spot they'd been since I moved in. They were on the side of my house, barely visible unless you were specifically looking for them. This was harassment. I took a photo of the notice and texted it to Marcus. He called me back within 20 minutes. "They're trying to intimidate you," he said. "This is classic HOA bully tactics. They're going to keep hitting you with petty violations, hoping you'll back down on the bonfire issue." So what do? We fight back. I'm going to draft a cease and desist letter. We'll also request an immediate hearing before the HOA board to dispute these violations. You have rights as a homeowner, and they can't just selectively enforce rules to harass you. The hearing was scheduled for the following Thursday evening at the community center, a small building near the neighborhood entrance that I'd never actually been inside. I showed up at 7 o'clock sharp with Marcus beside me, carrying a briefcase full of documents. The HOA board consisted of 5 people, all sitting behind a folding table like they were presiding over a criminal trial. Brenda sat in the middle, flanked by 2 men in their 60s and 2 other women who looked like they could be her sisters. Nameplates identified them as Robert Hendricks, Dale Morrison, Patricia Klein, and Susan DeMarco. About 15 other residents sat in chairs facing the board, presumably there to watch the proceedings. I recognized a few faces from around the neighborhood, but didn't know any of them by name. Brenda banged a gavel, which seemed absurdly dramatic for an HOA meeting. "This hearing is called to order. We're here to address multiple violations by Mr. Aaron Rodriguez of 1847 Lakeshore Drive." Marcus stood up. "Before we begin, I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Marcus Chen, attorney for Mr. Rodriguez. We're here to dispute the validity of these alleged violations and to request documentation regarding recent changes to the HOA covenants." The mood in the room shifted immediately. The board members exchanged glances. Brenda's face tightened. "Mr. Rodriguez doesn't need an attorney for a simple HOA hearing," she said. "Mr. Rodriguez has every right to legal representation," Marcus replied smoothly. "Now, shall we proceed?" Brenda shuffled some papers. "Fine. The first violation concerns an unauthorized bonfire on Saturday, June 3rd. The second violation concerns improper storage of trash receptacles. The third violation concerns the deteriorating condition of the private dock." Marcus opened his briefcase. "Let's address these one by one. First, the bonfire. I have a copy of the original HOA covenant signed when this property was purchased. Nowhere in these covenants is there any prohibition on fires on private property, provided they comply with local fire codes. Mr. Rodriguez's fire pit is fully compliant with Hennepin County regulations. It's a manufactured fire pit with proper clearance from structures and vegetation." "The rules were updated," Brenda interrupted. "That's all." "Yes, let's talk about that. Minnesota Statute 515. B.3103 requires that all homeowners be given written notice of covenant amendments. Mr. Rodriguez closed on his property on April 15th. According to your own statement, the alleged amendment was approved in March, and notices were supposedly mailed in March. However, the property deed wasn't transferred until April, meaning Mr. Rodriguez was not a homeowner of record when those notices went out. The HOA has a legal obligation to provide notice to current owners, not previous ones. The previous owner should have informed him, Patricia spoke up. "That's not how property law works," Marcus said. "The HOA has an independent duty to notify all current homeowners of covenant changes. Furthermore, we've requested copies of the meeting minutes and voting records for this supposed amendment. We haven't received them. Without proof that proper procedures were followed, these amendments may not be legally binding." The board members were whispering among themselves now. Brenda looked furious. "As for the trash cans," Marcus continued, "Mr. Rodriguez's trash receptacles are located on the side of his house, consistent with their placement for the past 3 months, and consistent with numerous other properties in this neighborhood. We have photographs showing at least 8 other homes with similarly positioned trash cans. This appears to be selective enforcement, which is prohibited under Minnesota HOA law. Those other homeowners aren't causing problems, Dale muttered. So you admit this is retaliatory? Marcus asked sharply. Because my client exercised his legal right to use his property, you're now targeting him with frivolous violations? Nobody said anything about retaliation, Robert interjected quickly. Good. Then you'll agree to withdraw these violations and cease further harassment of Mr. Rodriguez. Brenda's knuckles were white on her gavel. We'll take these matters under advisement. This hearing is adjourned. One more thing, Marcus said. We'll need those meeting minutes and all documentation related to the covenant amendments within 7 business days. If we don't receive them, we'll file a formal complaint with the Minnesota Attorney General's office and pursue legal action for harassment and selective enforcement. We walked out of there with me feeling about 10 feet tall. The looks on their faces had been priceless. That was amazing, I said to Marcus once we were outside. That was just the opening move, he replied. These people aren't going to give up easily. HOA boards like this one tend to be run by people who have way too much time on their hands and enjoy wielding power over their neighbors. They don't like being challenged. He was right. 3 days later, I got another violation notice. This time, it was for my lawn being inadequately maintained because there were allegedly weeds in my flower beds. I went outside and stared at my flower beds, which looked fine to me. There were a few dandelions near the back fence, but nothing crazy. I took pictures and sent them to Marcus. I also walked around the neighborhood that afternoon, taking photos of every single lawn I passed. Plenty of them had dandelions, clover, and other weeds. Mine was actually one of the better maintained properties. Marcus sent another letter, this one more strongly worded. He pointed out the continued pattern of harassment and reminded the board about Minnesota's laws against HOA abuse of power. He also noted that we still hadn't received the requested documentation. That Friday evening, I decided I'd had enough of playing defense. If they wanted to fight about fires, I'd give them something to really complain about. But I'd do it completely by the book. I spent Saturday morning researching Minnesota fire codes, county ordinances, and every regulation I could find about recreational fires. I called the Minnetonka Fire Department and spoke with a very helpful fire inspector named Tom, who explained exactly what was and wasn't allowed. As long as you're on private property, the fire is contained in a proper pit or ring. You maintain adequate clearance from structures and vegetation, you have water or a fire extinguisher readily available, and you're not creating a nuisance level of smoke. You're fine, Tom told me. The county doesn't have restrictions on fire size for recreational purposes on private property, as long as you're being safe about it. What about HOA rules? I asked. HOAs can't supersede county fire codes, he said. If the fire marshal says it's okay, an HOA can't prohibit it on private property. They might be able to regulate fires on common areas, but not on your own land. That was exactly what I needed to hear. I called Marcus and told him my plan. He was quiet for a long moment. You want to throw a party with a big bonfire, invite the whole neighborhood, and basically dare the HOA to do something about it? Exactly. But I want to make sure everything is absolutely legal. I'll get permits if needed, I'll follow every safety regulation, and I'll document everything. If they try to stop me or fine me, we'll have grounds for a lawsuit. Marcus laughed. You know what? I like it. Let's do this right. I'll help you draft invitations that cite the relevant regulations. We'll make it an educational event about property rights and fire safety. Get the fire department involved if you can. Over the next week, I put together what would become the most talked about event in the history of Lakeshore Estates. I contacted the Minnetonka Fire Department and asked if they'd be willing to do a fire safety demonstration at a community bonfire event. Tom, the inspector I'd spoken with, thought it was a great idea and said he'd come out with one of the firefighters to show proper fire safety techniques. I hired a lawyer. Well, actually, my lawyer, Marcus, helped me draft formal invitations that looked official and included citations to Minnesota statutes, Hennepin County codes, and local fire regulations. The invitation read, "You are cordially invited to a Lakefront fire safety and property rights educational event at 1847 Lakeshore Drive on Saturday, July 8th from 5 p.m. to 10 p.m. Join us for an evening of community bonding, fire safety education presented by the Minnetonka Fire Department, and a celebration of homeowner rights. Refreshments will be provided. This event is conducted in full compliance with all applicable fire codes and regulations. Please RSVP. I printed 100 copies and personally delivered one to every house in the neighborhood, including Brenda's. I also mailed copies to the HOA board members via certified mail so there'd be a paper trail. The next day, my phone rang. It was Brenda, and she was absolutely livid. "What do you think you're doing?" she demanded. "Hosting a community event," I said calmly. "I thought it would be good for the neighborhood to learn about fire safety and property rights." "You can't have a bonfire. I already told you that." "Actually, I can. I've consulted with the fire department, and everything I'm planning is completely legal under county and state regulations. The fire department is even coming to do a safety demonstration." "I'll call the police." "Feel free. I'll be happy to show them all my documentation. I'll also be recording the entire event, so if the police show up because of a false complaint, that'll be interesting." She hung up on me. 10 minutes later, Marcus called, laughing. "Dear guy, I just got a very angry voicemail from Brenda Patterson threatening legal action if you proceed with this event," he said. "I'm drafting a response that essentially says, 'Bring it on. This is amazing.'" The week leading up to the party was intense. I hired a catering company to provide burgers, hot dogs, and sides. I rented tables and chairs. I bought a massive fire pit, the kind used for commercial purposes, that was about 4 feet across and built like a tank. I arranged for a local band to play acoustic music. I even hired an event photographer to document everything. RSVPs started coming in, and I was shocked by how many people responded positively. Out of 100 invitations, I got 63 RSVPs saying they'd attend. A bunch of people called or emailed me personally to say they were sick of the HOA's overreach and were excited to see someone finally standing up to them. One neighbor, a retired teacher named George Martinez who lived 4 houses down, stopped by in person. Aaron, I just wanted to say thank you for doing this," he said. "I've lived here for 12 years, and Brenda's board has gotten progressively worse. They fined me $300 last year because my mailbox post was supposedly the wrong shade of white. I paid it because I didn't want the hassle, but it's been eating at me ever since. I'm glad someone's finally fighting back." Stories like that poured in. The HOA had been terrorizing residents for years with petty fines and ridiculous rules. People were afraid to push back because they didn't want to be targeted. My little rebellion had given others courage. On the Tuesday before the event, I got a certified letter from the HOA's attorney, a guy named Richard Benson from some firm in downtown Minneapolis. The letter stated that my planned event was in violation of HOA covenants and that if I proceeded, I would be subject to immediate fines of $5,000 plus legal fees. I scanned the letter and sent it to Marcus. He called me 20 minutes later. "This is garbage," he said. "They're bluffing. I'm going to respond by laying out all the legal reasons why they have no authority to stop you. I'm also going to point out that if they continue this harassment, you'll be filing a lawsuit for damages, including legal fees, emotional distress, and violation of your property rights." Will that actually work? It should. But Aaron, I need you to understand something. If you go through with this party, they're going to come after you hard. They might try to fine you anyway, figuring you'll back down rather than go to court. Are you prepared for that? I thought about it. I thought about all the money I'd spent on legal fees already. I thought about how this was supposed to be my peaceful retirement, not a war with a power-hungry HOA. But then I thought about George and all the other neighbors who'd been bullied by this board for years. I'm prepared," I said. "Let's do this." Marcus sent his response letter, which was basically a legal middle finger to the HOA. He cited case law, state statutes, and even threw in some constitutional arguments about property rights. He ended by saying that any attempt to fine or sanction me for this lawful event would be met with immediate legal action. Saturday, July 8th dawned sunny and clear, perfect weather for a bonfire. I spent the morning setting up, arranging tables, testing the sound system for the band, and prepping the massive fire pit. Tom from the fire department came by around 3 to inspect everything. "This is great," he said, walking around the fire pit. "You've got proper clearance, good positioning away from structures and trees, and this pit itself is commercial grade. No issues from a fire safety perspective." "What about the HOA?" I asked. Tom shook his head. "I've dealt with HOAs before. They have no authority over fire codes. If they try to tell you this isn't allowed, they're wrong. You're on private property, following all regulations. They can pound sand." At 4:30, I started the fire. I used proper fire starting techniques, building it up slowly with kindling and small logs before adding larger pieces. By 5 o'clock, I had a beautiful fire going, and the first guests started arriving. George showed up with his wife, both of them grinning. "This is fantastic," he said, shaking my hand. "I haven't seen the neighborhood this excited about anything in years." More people arrived, families with kids, couples, a few single folks my age. By 5:30, I had at least 50 people in my yard, and the party was in full swing. The caterers were serving food, the band was playing classic rock covers, and the fire was blazing magnificently. At 6 o'clock, Tom and another firefighter arrived in their official truck. They set up a small demonstration area and spent 30 minutes teaching kids and adults about fire safety, how to use fire extinguishers, and what to do in case of a fire emergency. People were taking pictures, asking questions, and genuinely engaged. It was perfect. At 6:45, Brenda arrived. She didn't come alone. She brought 4 other board members and their attorney, Richard Benson, all of them marching up my driveway like they were leading an invasion. I walked over to meet them, with Marcus appearing at my side. A lot of the party guests noticed and started watching. "Mr. Rodriguez, I'm ordering you to extinguish that fire immediately," Brenda announced loudly. "On what grounds?" I asked. "It's a violation of HOA covenants." "Which covenant specifically?" "Section 12, paragraph 4, she said triumphantly. "That's the section about noise after 10 p.m., I said. "It has nothing to do with fires. Would you like to try again?" Richard Benson stepped forward. "Mr. Rodriguez, the HOA has broad authority to regulate activities that impact the community." "Not on private property when those activities are legal and properly permitted," Marcus countered. "I'm Marcus Chen, Mr. Rodriguez's attorney. Your client has been harassing my client for weeks with frivolous violations and threats. This event is in full compliance with all applicable fire codes and has been inspected and approved by the Minnetonka Fire Department. If your clients attempt to interfere with this lawful gathering, we'll pursue legal action for harassment, intimidation, and violation of property rights." "You can't threaten us," Patricia snapped. "That's not a threat," Marcus said calmly. "It's a statement of fact. Your board has been selectively enforcing rules, issuing violations without proper basis, and attempting to prohibit lawful activities on private property. We have documentation of everything." Tom, who'd been watching from near the fire, walked over. "Is there a problem here?" "Who are you?" Brenda demanded. "Tom Rodriguez from the Minnetonka Fire Department. This fire has been inspected and approved. It meets all safety codes and regulations. If you have concerns about fire safety, you can file a complaint with our office, but I'm telling you right now there's nothing wrong here." "This isn't about fire safety," Brenda said. "This is about community standards." "Community standards don't supersede county fire codes," Tom said. "This is legal. End of story." I could see Brenda's face turning red. She looked at Richard, who just shrugged slightly. They had no legal ground to stand on, and they knew it. "This isn't over," Brenda hissed at me. "We'll be issuing fines." "Go ahead," I said. "We'll see you in court." They left, all of them stomping back to their cars. The party guests actually applauded as they drove away. Someone started chanting, "Aaron, Aaron," and others joined in. It was surreal and hilarious and deeply satisfying. The party went until almost 11 p.m. People had an amazing time. The fire burned bright and safe all evening. The band played, kids roasted marshmallows, and I must have had 24 people come up to thank me for standing up to the HOA. A couple of people even asked if I'd consider running for the board next election cycle. The next week, I received a notice of fine $5,000 for unauthorized event creating community disturbance and fire hazard. The notice was completely official-looking, with citations to HOA rules and a deadline for payment. I sent it to Marcus, who immediately filed a lawsuit against the HOA in Hennepin County District Court. The suit alleged harassment, selective enforcement, violation of property rights, and demanded the fine be vacated plus compensation for legal fees and damages. The case moved slowly, as legal cases do. We spent months in discovery, exchanging documents, taking depositions. The HOA's attorney tried to argue that the board had broad discretion to regulate community activities, but Marcus systematically demolished every argument with citations to Minnesota law and precedent. The turning point came during Brenda's deposition in October. Marcus asked her a series of questions about how the bonfire rule had been enacted. "When did the board decide to prohibit fires?" Marcus asked. "At our March meeting," Brenda said. "And how was that decision made?" "We voted on it." "What was the vote tally?" Brenda hesitated. 3-2. "And was there a quorum present?" Another hesitation. "Yes." "How many board members are there total?" 5. "So all 5 were present for this vote?" "Yes." Marcus pulled out a document. "I have the minutes from the March meeting. According to these minutes, only 4 board members were present. Dale Morrison was absent. Is that correct?" Brenda's face went pale. "I think so, yes." "And according to your own bylaws, decisions regarding covenant amendments require a 2/3 majority of the full board. With 5 board members, that means you need 4 votes in favor. But you only had 3 votes from 4 present members. That's not a 2/3 majority of the full 5-member board." "That's not how we interpreted it," Brenda said weakly. "I'm not asking for your interpretation. I'm asking if the vote was 3-2 with 1 member absent. Yes or no?" "Yes." "So the amendment to add the fire prohibition was not properly adopted according to your own bylaws. Is that correct?" Brenda's attorney objected, but the damage was done. Marcus had proved that the HOA had violated its own rules in trying to prohibit fires. The entire basis for their harassment campaign was invalid, but it got better. During further document review, Marcus discovered that Brenda had failed to include several important items in the meeting minutes. He found emails between board members that discussed the fire prohibition, and some of those emails were sent before I even had my first bonfire. They'd been planning to target me specifically because I'd complained at a prior meeting about the HOA's overreach on approving exterior home improvements. In November, Marcus filed an amended complaint adding allegations of targeted harassment and conspiracy. He argued that the HOA board had manufactured rules specifically to punish me for exercising my property rights and criticizing their authority. The case went to trial in January. It was held in the Hennepin County Courthouse in downtown Minneapolis in front of Judge Catherine Willoughby. The trial lasted 3 days. Marcus called me as his first witness. I testified about buying the property, about my first bonfire, about Brenda's visits and the escalating violations. I explained how I'd researched the regulations, consulted with the fire department, and done everything by the book. I talked about the harassment and the stress of dealing with constant threats and violations for simply trying to enjoy my own property. The HOA's attorney tried to paint me as a troublemaker who was deliberately antagonizing the board, but Marcus countered by calling several other homeowners as witnesses, people like George, who testified about years of HOA overreach and abuse. One woman, Linda Schultz, broke down crying on the stand as she described how the HOA had fined her $2,000 for planting roses in her front yard without prior approval, even though the covenant said nothing about needing approval for landscaping. Marcus called Tom from the fire department, who testified that my fire pit and bonfire event were completely safe and legal. He also testified that Brenda had called the fire marshal's office 3 times, trying to get them to declare my event a hazard, and each time she'd been told there was no basis for that determination. The most dramatic moment came when Marcus called Richard Benson, the HOA's attorney, as a witness. Under oath, Richard admitted that he'd advised the board that their fire prohibition probably wasn't legally enforceable, but that they might be able to use it to pressure me into compliance. He admitted that he'd known the $5,000 fine had no legal basis, but issued it anyway because the board insisted. On the 3rd day, Judge Willoughby heard closing arguments. Marcus laid out the case methodically. The HOA had violated its own procedures in adopting the fire rule, had selectively enforced other rules against me, had ignored proper notice requirements, and had engaged in systematic harassment. He argued that this was a clear case of HOA abuse and requested that the court void the fine, award damages, and order the HOA to revise its procedures. The HOA's attorney argued that the board had been acting in good faith to maintain community standards and that any procedural errors were minor technical issues. Judge Willoughby took 2 weeks to issue her ruling. I got the call from Marcus on a Thursday afternoon in late January. "We won," he said, and I could hear the grin in his voice. "We won big." The judge's order was 32 pages long and absolutely scathing. She found that the HOA had violated multiple provisions of Minnesota HOA law, had acted in bad faith, had engaged in targeted harassment, and had abused its authority. She voided the $5,000 fine and ordered the HOA to pay me $50,000 in damages plus all my legal fees, which came to another $40,000. She also ordered the HOA to revise its procedures, provide training to board members on proper governance, and submit to oversight by a court-appointed monitor for 2 years. But the best part was her written conclusion. HOAs exist to serve homeowners, not to tyrannize them. The actions of this board represent a troubling abuse of power that cannot be tolerated in a civil society. Property owners have fundamental rights, and those rights cannot be trampled by overzealous board members who mistake authority for power. The judgment was reported in the local news. The Minneapolis Star-Tribune ran an article titled "Homeowner Wins Big in HOA Abuse Case" that detailed the whole saga. I did an interview where I talked about the importance of standing up to HOA overreach and knowing your rights as a property owner. The fallout for the HOA board was swift. Within a month, 3 of the 5 board members resigned, including Brenda. The remaining members called a special election, and several reform-minded candidates ran on platforms of limiting HOA power and focusing on actual community needs rather than petty rule enforcement. George asked me to run for the board, and after thinking about it, I agreed. The election was in March, and I won easily, along with 3 other reform candidates. Our first act was to repeal about half the rules in the covenants, including all the ridiculous aesthetic standards that had been used to harass people. We kept rules that actually mattered, like maintaining safe properties and not creating legitimate nuisances, but got rid of all the petty nonsense about mailbox colors and trash can visibility. We also changed the fine structure so that fines could only be issued after a proper hearing with the homeowner present, and we created an appeals process so people could challenge violations without having to hire lawyers. In April, I received my check from the HOA for $90,000. It more than covered my legal fees and compensated me for the months of stress and harassment. I used some of it to upgrade my fire pit to an even bigger permanent stone structure that became the neighborhood gathering place. On the first anniversary of my big bonfire party, I threw another one. This time, it was an official neighborhood HOA event, properly organized and advertised. We had even more people, more food, and an even bigger fire. Tom from the fire department came back to do another safety demonstration. George gave a speech thanking everyone who'd supported the reform effort. Brenda didn't show up. I'd heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she'd moved to Arizona to be near her daughter. Patricia and Susan had also moved away. Dale and Robert kept to themselves and didn't cause any trouble. The new HOA board focused on actual community improvements. We organized neighborhood cleanups, created a community garden, and started a fund for maintaining common areas properly. People actually liked the HOA now, which was a novel concept. As for me, I finally got to enjoy my lakefront property the way I'd always dreamed. I had fires regularly, usually with friends and neighbors joining me. I spent summer evenings on my dock, which I never did paint because it looked fine the way it was. I kayaked on the lake, hosted barbecues, and generally lived the peaceful life I'd worked so hard to achieve. The whole experience taught me something important about standing up for yourself. A lot of people just accept that HOAs have unlimited power and that there's nothing you can do if they come after you. But that's not true. There are laws that protect property owners, and HOAs that abuse their authority can be held accountable. It takes courage to fight back, and it often takes money to hire a good lawyer, but sometimes it's worth it, not just for yourself, but for everyone else being victimized by the same abuse. Marcus and I became good friends through the whole ordeal. He later told me it was one of his favorite cases because it combined property law, constitutional issues, and the satisfaction of taking down bullies. He ended up specializing in HOA disputes and built a whole practice around defending homeowners from abusive boards. In June, the court-appointed monitor submitted his first report to Judge Willoughby. He noted that the HOA had implemented all required reforms, that board meetings were now conducted properly with appropriate notice and procedures, and that complaints from homeowners had dropped to nearly zero. The judge commended the new board for our work in transforming the community governance. That summer, I decided to take the bonfire concept even further. I started a tradition called Lakefront Fridays, where anyone in the neighborhood could come to my place on Friday evenings for a fire, weather permitting. It became incredibly popular. Sometimes we'd have just a handful of people, other times we'd have 30 or 40. Kids would roast marshmallows, adults would share drinks and conversation, and the fire would burn bright and legal and beautiful. One Friday in July, a couple who'd just moved into the neighborhood showed up. Their names were Alex Richards and his wife Emma Morrison. They were young, maybe early 30s, and had just bought the house 3 doors down. "We heard about what you did with the HOA," Alex said. "That's actually one of the reasons we bought here. We looked up the news articles and court case. We wanted to live in a place where people stand up for their rights." That comment stuck with me. The whole nightmare with Brenda and the old board had turned into something positive. It had changed the character of the neighborhood and attracted people who valued freedom and community over rigid control and petty rules. In August, I got a call from a reporter at a Minnesota public radio station. They were doing a series on HOA governance and reform and wanted to interview me. The resulting story aired in September and included interviews with me, Marcus, George, and even Judge Willoughby, who spoke generally about HOA law and the need for proper oversight. The story sparked interest from other communities dealing with HOA problems. I started getting emails and calls from people all over Minnesota and even other states, asking for advice on fighting back against abusive boards. I couldn't help everyone, but I tried to point people toward resources and attorneys who could assist them. In October, the Minnesota legislature held hearings on HOA reform legislation. I was invited to testify along with Marcus and several other homeowners who dealt with HOA abuse. The committee was considering a bill that would strengthen homeowner rights, require better training for board members, and create clearer procedures for challenging HOA actions. I told my story to the committee, emphasizing how vulnerable homeowners are when boards act in bad faith. "Most people can't afford to hire an attorney and go to court," I said. "They just pay the fines and live with the harassment because they don't see any other option. We need laws that make it easier for ordinary people to challenge HOA overreach without risking financial ruin." The bill passed the committee and was scheduled for a full vote in the next legislative session. Marcus was cautiously optimistic that it would become law. That fall, I ran for re-election to the HOA board. I won by a landslide, receiving more votes than any other candidate. The message was clear. The neighborhood supported the reforms and wanted to continue down this path. As the year wound down, I reflected on everything that had happened. What started as a simple desire to have bonfires on my own property had turned into a major legal battle, a community transformation, and even a small role in statewide reform efforts. It had been exhausting and expensive and stressful, but it had been worth it. On New Year's Eve, I threw one final bonfire of the year. It was cold, with snow on the ground and temperatures in the low 20s, but we had a great turnout. People bundled up in winter coats and gathered around the fire, sharing hot chocolate and whiskey and stories about the year that had been. At midnight, as fireworks went off over the lake, George raised his cup in a toast. To Aaron, who reminded us all that we don't have to accept tyranny, even from our own HOA, to property rights, to community, and to the right to have a damn bonfire on your own land. Everyone cheered and drank. The fire crackled and blazed, throwing warmth and light against the cold winter night. My phone buzzed with text messages from friends and neighbors, all celebrating the new year and the new community we'd built together. I looked around at all the faces illuminated by firelight, at the genuine smiles and laughter, at the sense of belonging and shared purpose. This was what I'd wanted when I bought this property. Not just a nice house on a lake, but a real home in a real community where people looked out for each other and stood together against those who'd abused their power. The fire burned on into the early hours of the morning, and even when the last guests finally headed home and I extinguished the flames, the warmth remained. It wasn't just the physical warmth of the fire, but something deeper, a satisfaction that comes from fighting for what's right and winning, from standing up to bullies and watching them fall, from taking something broken and helping to fix it. As I locked up my house and headed to bed that night, I thought about Brenda and her clipboard and her threats, and I smiled. She'd tried to stop me from having bonfires on my own lakefront property, thinking her position as HOA president gave her unlimited power over how I lived my life. Instead, I'd hired a lawyer, documented everything, researched the law, and thrown the biggest, most legally compliant, most perfectly executed bonfire event the neighborhood had ever seen. I'd turned her petty tyranny into a rallying cry for reform. I'd transformed a community that lived in fear of HOA violations into one that celebrated property rights and individual freedom. And every Friday night, weather permitting, I'd light another fire and welcome anyone who wanted to join me. Because that's what property rights look like in action. That's what community looks like when it's built on respect rather than control. That's what happens when ordinary people refuse to be pushed around and stand up for what's right. The bonfire ban had been Brenda's biggest mistake. My response had become the HOA's biggest fire yet, a blaze of legal action and community reform that had burned away years of abusive governance and lit the way toward something better. And the fire was still burning.